All right, let's talk about the Oscars. Yeah, everyone knows they're a big deal, right? The red carpet,
Yeah.
the speeches, the whole thing. But
Yeah.
beyond the glamour, there's a deeper story hidden within those golden statues.
Hmm.
A story about who gets recognized and who gets left out. And that's what we're diving into today. We've got some research here that takes a hard look at gender representation in the so-called gender-neutral Oscar categories. You know, the ones where men and women are
Yeah.
supposed to compete on a level playing field?
It's fascinating because we often focus on the acting awards, which are divided by gender. But this research dives into those categories where, theoretically, anyone has a shot.
Exactly. And we're not just talking about a handful of awards here. This research analyzed a massive data set, 9,530 nominations across 13 different categories spanning from the very first Oscars in 1929 all the way to 2024. That's almost a century's worth of data.
Yeah.
Data on the screen, numbers come alive. Male, female flows where the patterns thrive. Visual charts, public colors unify. Gender decoded, bringing truth to light. Small drum fill. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling, facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide.
Okay, so picture this. You're standing on that Oscar stage. You know the one with the iconic golden statue? It's like the ultimate dream for anyone in film, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But what if your chances of even getting nominated were totally different just because of, your gender?
That's a big question.
And that's what we're diving into today, this whole idea of gender disparity at the Oscars. And not just in the acting categories, but like
Yeah.
best director, cinematography, sound mixing, all those roles behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's interesting how often we just focus on, who's winning Best Actor or Actress.
Yeah,
But those other categories, they really shape a film, don't they?
totally. And today we're looking at a research article called Gender Disparity in the Oscars, a statistical analysis. And these researchers, they crunched data on over 9,500 Oscar nominations across 13 of these gender-neutral categories, going all the way back to 1929.
Wow, 1929, that's almost a century of data.
It's wild, right? So over 9,500 nominations, tons of data. What was the most striking thing you found in this research?
Honestly, just the huge imbalance. Across all 13 categories, women have received only about 12.1% of the nominations,
That's comparative.
compared to men at, 87.9%.
Wow.
And it's almost the same for the actual wins, too. Women are taking home around 12% of those awards as well.
So it's almost like a 7-to-1 ratio then.
Yeah,
In
exactly.
fact, it's not even close.
And this pattern, it kind of repeats across so many categories. Like, picture those nomination lists for things like cinematography,
Yeah.
sound mixing, visual effects. Men hold over 90% of the spots.
Yeah, you have to wonder, is it that women just aren't interested in those fields? Or is there something else going on?
Right, it's easy to jump to conclusions, but those numbers are pretty hard to ignore.
Totally. Now, there is one category that's kind of the exception here, costume design. In this one, women and men have roughly the same number of nominations, around 300 each, and women even win against both genders about 10% of the time. So why is costume design so different?
It's really interesting, right? Because it challenges that assumption that, women just aren't interested in technical stuff. Because costume design, it's artistic, sure, but it takes technical skills too.
All right.
And the research suggests that maybe it's because of how society sees the whole field. Costume design has always been linked to fashion, textiles, things that historically have been seen as more, feminine, I guess.
Interesting.
So that might be why it's been easier for women to get into, which could explain why the nominations are so balanced.
So it's all about perception. There are these invisible barriers around certain fields just because of how we've traditionally viewed them.
It seems that way.
And if costume design can be so balanced, what does that tell us about all those other categories?
Yeah, that's a good question. It suggests that maybe it's not that women lack the talent or the drive, but that there are these deep-rooted societal norms that have kind of shaped the opportunities in the film industry. Like, take Best Director, for example. No woman has ever won that award, ever. and only 25 out of 400 nominations have gone to women.
Wow, that's a huge contrast to costume design. And it's not just a historical thing, right? We're still seeing this gap today.
Yeah, unfortunately. There have been some amazing female directors nominated lately, but no one's taken home the big prize yet. It makes you wonder if there's still a bias, even if it's unconscious, about who we see as capable of being a director.
Right. Makes you wonder if those same biases, those invisible barriers, are at play in those other technical fields too, where men dominate the nominations. The research mentioned historical hiring practices as a factor. What exactly does that mean?
Well, there's probably a mix of things. I mean, there was definitely overt discrimination, but there were also more subtle systemic issues. For example, a lot of those technical roles were filled through apprenticeships and, informal networks, which historically were mostly made up of men.
Oh, I see.
So it created this cycle where women were often excluded,
Yeah.
making it even harder to get the experience and connections they needed.
Just like self-perpetuating. The lack of women reinforces the idea that they're men's jobs, which makes it even harder for women to break in.
Yeah, it's much more complicated than just saying, hire more women.
Right. It's way more nuanced than that. And it's not just about hiring practices either. We have to think about societal stereotypes too. Like, for so long, women were pushed towards certain professions that were seen as more, appropriate for them, while other jobs were considered men's work. How much of that pressure is still around today, influencing the career choices women make, even subconsciously?
Yeah, it's hard to say. It's a really complex issue, like trying to untangle a really knotted mess. You have to look at every thread to understand the bigger picture.
And we're just getting started. We've kind of set the stage here, but there's so much more to unpack. What does all this data mean for the future of filmmaking? Are things actually changing? Or are these patterns just too ingrained?
That's what we'll be digging into next. We'll look at whether the industry is really evolving, or if these are just surface-level changes. Are those invisible barriers coming down? Or are they just harder to see now?
Stay tuned. We've been talking about these pretty heavy stats about gender disparity at the Oscars. And it's not just about the awards themselves, right? I mean, the Oscars are kind of seen as like the gold standard for filmmaking. So what does all this tell us about the industry as a whole?
Yeah, it makes you think about whose stories are considered important enough to be told and who actually gets to tell them, If women are constantly missing from those, key roles behind the scenes, the writers, the directors, the cinematographers, then we're probably missing out on a lot of perspectives on screen too.
That makes sense. Like, we're only seeing a very narrow slice of life. But couldn't you say that a talented male director can still tell stories about women, about different experiences? Where's the line between representation behind the camera and the stories being told?
That's a really good point. And yeah, the director doesn't have to be the same as their characters to tell their stories well,
Right.
But there's something to be said for lived experience, I think. It brings a depth and an understanding that you might not get otherwise.
I see what you mean.
And if we keep limiting the voices behind the camera, we risk falling back on stereotypes and limiting the kinds of stories we see.
So it's not just about more stories about women. It's about having more women in positions to tell those stories, to bring their own unique point of view.
Exactly. And it goes beyond gender, too. It's about diversity of all kinds, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability. The more inclusive the filmmaking process is, the richer the stories will get.
I like that. So we talked about historical hiring practices, societal stereotypes, all these things that have contributed to the disparity. But what about right now? What can the industry actually do to break down those barriers and make things more fair?
Well, there's no easy solution. But a few things come to mind. First, we need to keep pushing for a more diverse academy. The people who vote on the awards.
Makes sense.
If the voting body is more representative, it stands to reason that we'll see a wider range of films and filmmakers recognized.
Yeah, if the people choosing the nominees and winners are all coming from similar backgrounds, it makes sense that their choices might reflect that.
Exactly. We also need to address those stereotypes, the ones that influence career choices from a really young age. Imagine if young girls saw more female directors, cinematographers, editors, winning awards, being celebrated for their work.
That would be amazing.
It sends a powerful message, doesn't it? It shows them that those paths are open to them too.
So instead of being pushed towards certain acceptable careers, they're encouraged to follow their passions no matter what.
Exactly. Things like mentorship programs, networking events, specifically for women in film, can help a lot too. They provide support and connections. And the industry itself needs to step up and make sure there are equal opportunities for hiring and promotion.
So it's not just about getting more women into the field, it's about creating an environment where they can thrive
Yes.
and challenging those biases that might prevent them from, getting that next opportunity, that next promotion.
Exactly. We need to hold studios and production companies accountable. Are they actively looking for female candidates for all roles, not just the ones that have always been seen as women's roles? Are they creating inclusive work environments where women feel supported?
So it's a multifaceted approach, really. Changing perceptions, providing support, holding the industry accountable. Now, the research did mention a potential bright spot. It seems there's been a slow but steady decrease in the percentage of male nominations over time. In the last decade, it dropped to 73.1%. Is that a sign that things are getting better?
Cool.
Or is it too early to say?
It's definitely a positive trend, but we need to look at it carefully. Is it statistically significant or just a random blip?
Right.
Is it connected to specific changes in the industry, like more diversity initiatives? Or a shift in what audiences want to see?
So we need to dig deeper. We can't just look at one number and say, problem solved.
Exactly.
We have to understand the context, the nuances.
Yeah, we need to ask those tough questions. Is this happening in all categories? Or just a few? Are more women being nominated for the top awards? Or are they still concentrated in specific areas?
We have to look beyond the surface level, right?
Exactly. Real change takes time and commitment. It's about shifting the whole culture of the industry, creating an environment that's truly equitable and inclusive, where talent and creativity are recognized, no matter who you are.
Yeah, it sounds like a long road ahead, but it feels like there's a real sense of urgency here. This isn't just about statistics and awards, right? It's about fundamental fairness, the right to have your voice heard, to tell your story.
You got it. It's about creating a film industry that reflects the real world in all its diversity. And that takes all of us working together. The studios, the academy, the audiences.
So what can we do as viewers, as people who love movies? How can we support this change?
Well, you could start by seeking out films made by women, by diverse filmmakers in general. Support their work, tell your friends about it, amplify their voices.
So be conscious consumers. Think about the films we choose to watch, the stories we support.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to speak up. If you see a lack of diversity, say something. Talk about it with your friends and family. The more we talk about these issues, the more we normalize them.
Keep the conversation going.
Exactly. We need to keep asking those tough questions, pushing for transparency, celebrating the people who are making a difference.
It's a long road, but it's worth it.
I think so.
So we've explored the numbers, the history, the challenges. But what about the future? Are there any examples of filmmakers or initiatives that give you hope, that show us what's possible?
That's actually what we'll be talking about in the last part of our deep dive. We'll look at some inspiring examples of women who are changing the game and initiatives that are making a real impact, and even new technologies that are opening up new possibilities for storytelling.
We've really been digging deep into this whole issue of gender disparity at the Oscars and, by extension, kind of looking at the film industry as a whole. But amidst all these numbers and systemic challenges we've talked about, I'm curious about the actual people, the stories of women who are out there, breaking boundaries and changing the game. Are there any examples that come to mind that really highlight this shift towards more representation?
Oh, absolutely. When I was going through the research, one story that stood out to me was Rachel Morrison. Back in 2018, she became the first woman ever nominated for Best Cinematography for the film Mudbound. It was a huge deal, like a real sign that maybe those barriers were finally starting to crumble.
Yeah, it's one thing to talk about change, right? But to actually see someone break through that glass ceiling, that's pretty powerful. But does one nomination really mean that much? Is it a sign of real change or just a one-off?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's still too early to say for sure. But the good news is Morrison's nomination wasn't totally isolated. We've seen other women, like Mandy Walker. She was nominated this year for Elvis. And it's not just happening in Hollywood either.
Oh, really? So it's like a global thing.
The research pointed to some really cool initiatives around the world. For example, in Sweden, they've put in place this 50-50 funding model.
What's that?
Basically, it means films that have gender-balanced production teams are given priority when it comes to getting funding.
Wow, that's pretty forward-thinking. So it's not just about encouraging diversity. It's like a requirement built into the system.
Exactly.
Has it actually made a difference?
It seems to be working. Sweden's seen a big increase in the number of women working in those key creative and technical roles, not just the ones that have always been considered, you know, women's work. It shows that when you actually put mechanisms in place, things can actually change. Of course, not everyone's happy about it. Some people say it could lead to tokenism, or that filmmakers will be forced to prioritize quotas over talent.
Yeah, I can see that argument.
But I think the early results are promising.
It makes you wonder if other countries might follow suit, if this could become like a new standard for the industry.
It's definitely worth keeping an eye on. And along with these policy changes, technology is also shaking things up. The rise of streaming platforms and independent filmmaking has given more women the chance to create and share their work outside of that traditional studio system.
So they're kind of bypassing the gatekeepers.
Exactly. And who knows what new opportunities will come about with things like VR and AR, virtual and augmented reality. Imagine the possibilities for diverse storytelling.
Yeah, it's like we're entering this whole new era of filmmaking, one that's more open to different voices and perspectives. But even with all this new tech, those core issues we've been talking about, those biases and barriers, they don't just magically disappear, do they?
No, you're right. Technology can help, but it's not a cure-all. We still need to actively challenge those biases, break down those barriers. And that takes effort from all of us, the filmmakers, the studios, the critics, the audiences.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm feeling, I don't know, cautiously optimistic. There are definitely signs of progress, but there's still a long way to go. And I think you said it best earlier. It's about creating a film industry, a world where everyone has the chance to tell their story and be heard.
Absolutely. It's about more than just awards and recognition. It's about a richer, more vibrant cinematic landscape, one that truly reflects the diversity of human experience.
Well said. So to all our listeners out there, the next time you watch a film, think about this. Whose story is being told? Whose voices are we hearing? And how can we, as viewers, as people who care about film, support a more equitable and inclusive industry? Because in the end, it benefits all of us. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.